And the child's mind, before they've been thoroughly indoctrinated, the mind works completely different because they're not told you're wrong about everything. Because if you can brainwash somebody by simply telling them you're not seeing what you think you're seeing, just like 1984. So an adult cares more about not looking stupid than a child, because their adults are scared of sounding stupid. So their perception of reality is more based on that fear, their ego, than it is on actual reality. And you can see how that explains when you speak wisdom to a fool, all they hear is foolishness. Through my psychology podcast, I talk about how mental weakness that's one of the biggest issues, more so than intelligence. Because you don't have to be that smart to understand some of these concepts. But if you're mentally weak, you're not even going to want to try, because you need what I call coincidence theorists. They need their safety blanket of authorities to tell them what everything is, so they don't have to think about it for themselves. So they need their blankie. But if to overcome that mental weakness, you can start to open your mind and think, okay, well, if everything's not as advertised, now you can start to really think about some.
Hello, it's April 2025. Now in this video, I'm going to be using someone that was by the name of Cameron Todd Willingham and his wrongful conviction that led to his execution by the state of Texas. Now, my recent videos turned into a video series focusing on Psyops, and I highlighted, for example, in my original video, how there are a plethora of innocent people being convicted, and how the common person in society doesn't care. Now, this story of Willingham is tragic, and it does tie in, to example, with Psyops. Primarily what we're going to see here as we go through this is how the studies made famous by Julia Shaw, someone that I've been highlighting for perhaps almost a decade, how false memories play a role, compounded with people who are deliberately lying. And this type of story I can relate to with my efforts in Calgary, Alberta. Now, when it comes to Psyops, people tend to think, and I've shown how Psyops really focus on the general population of society and how it's used to manipulate large groups of people. However, when you actually look at the elements that make up a psyop, we can see the same type of thing happening with small groups of people. And psyops, for example, tend to be deliberate, with an agenda, usually not a very good one. Sometimes a psyop can evolve as a descriptive on its own, but still have devastating consequences. Now, when we look at, for example, how, going back to my original video talking about all the innocent people, and I used 3 examples in that video, very famous cases not so famous case, and a couple of large group cases. And we see how devastating wrongful convictions based on false narratives, based on false accusations, the impact it has on individuals, not only them, but the people in their lives. Now, the story of Willingham, I'm going to briefly go over this. It was in the early 1990s. Apparently he was at home. His 3 daughters, if I'm not mistaken, were in bed sleeping or something. There was a fire that had broke out, and he did try to rescue his 3 daughters. His wife was out shopping apparently. And he had run out of the house because the flames just simply took over the house. At one point, while he was trying to break windows, and the fire was just bursting out through the windows after he smashed them because of the oxygen and everything else, he thought to move his vehicle away from the house, so he just pushed it, like put it in neutral and pushed it down the driveway. And what he would say later is because he didn't want the vehicle to catch on fire and explode and cause more damage. Now, whether that would have actually happened or not, you have to remember, somebody in that state of mind, they're in shock, they're in panic. His daughters are in there. Apparently he could hear them screaming until they stopped. So he's maybe not even thinking rationally, but he did try to conclude, well, if the car caught on fire because the flames were just bursting out of the windows of the house, could have made things a lot worse. Now, here's where things start to really go sideways for him. He became the primary suspect of arson. Despite there being no evidence of arson, they found an accelerant fluid on the front porch beside a barbecue, which makes sense. And when you think about that, and firefighters spraying water, some could have spilt further on the porch, who knows, but there was no accelerant found in the house. And the prosecutor of that, who apparently is now a judge, believe it or not, said the burn patterns in the one room look like a pentagram. But each point part of the fire led to a window, which makes sense because the oxygen coming from the windows would have fed the fire and pulled the fire towards those points. There's 5 windows. Long story short, they convicted him merely on their biased opinions and beliefs. Now we have people who deliberately lied. So when he was in jail, his cellmate had said, yeah, he told me that he had killed his children in this fire and everything else. Later he would recant. Initially, his wife, would later become his ex-wife, said no, he would have never done that. She was supporting him. But then over time, she changed her story with pressure from her family and others who actually thought he was guilty. Now, what we have here is the opinion, biased opinion of, for example, alleged authority types who then basically pursue a criminal action against them, criminal charges, and people default by saying, oh, somebody in authority says this, there must be some truth to it, if not the whole thing is true. And this is where we see, for example, the studies made famous by Julia Shaw, Implanting False Memories. And if I'm not mistaken, she also wrote a book about how witness testimonies are in question, whether they be the commoner's testimony as a witness, or even as a professional, for example, as someone in law enforcement or a so-called expert in something. False memories creates a false narrative. And as Julia Shaw says in one of her interviews when she was discussing one of her research subjects implanting a false memory, who apparently she convinced that she committed some sort of bad crime against someone else, she says it goes from, well, yeah, that maybe that could be, to, well, this is how it would have happened, to absolute. And I'm kind of bastardizing everything, but you get the idea. People start to imagine what could have been, and what could have been turns into what happened ultimately. Ignoring the evidence, people convince themselves. And this is a real foundation, for example, of injustice, tyranny, through false accusations, false narratives, and wrongful convictions. But again, I want to highlight how these so-called freedom fighters, and perhaps even truthers, they don't care. Primarily because, well, that's their problem, not mine. But they're too stupid to see that it's all these little cases. When I say little, I'm not belittling any of these cases, but these isolated individual cases set the foundation for bigger injustices, greater tyrannies. Perhaps even, when you think about it, when someone is falsely accused, arrested, maliciously prosecuted, wrongfully convicted, and the whole 9 yards, and everyone knows that this person is innocent, and they go to jail. And as with the case that I've mentioned in the beginning with this father and this fire in the house, ended up costing him his life, an innocent man. I'm going to stop here for a second. This is why many of the states in the United States and Canada abolished the death penalty, because one, it costs a lot more money to put someone through to death row than it is to keep them in prison for life. But all the innocent people who have been put to death by the government because, hey, we found them guilty. And everyone says, well, that was what I concluded at the time, that was the evidence that was given, blah, blah, blah. And they have qualified immunity and everything else. They're just doing their job. No one's held accountable. Now, let's parallel this, for example, with this individual story, Willingham story, with, say, something like Ruby Ridge, or even Waco, Texas. Everyone lost their lives because of assumptions and false narratives, and perhaps even people lying, blatantly lying, knowing that they were lying, cost them their lives. You see what I'm getting at here, and how everything's connected, how the foundation is set. Now, with Ruby Ridge in Waco, Texas, there was no arrest, there was no trial or anything else. These people were executed outside of the justice system, but the same principles apply. And there's countless of cases every day of innocent people being wrongfully convicted. Every day. Again, so-called freedom fighters and even truthers, they don't care, because it doesn't affect them. And I've highlighted, for example, with these fake heroes of the convoy, how none of them display any of the symptoms as a descriptive of someone who was falsely accused, wrongfully convicted. I've showed that in some overlays. In fact, they're enjoying the attention that they're getting because they're nobody's prior and they messed up. They are guilty, and they've convinced through a very smart marketing campaign that there's some sort of political prisoners and everything else, which a lot of people bought into. People who, again, are making uninformed conclusions based on their limited knowledge base, lacking critical thinking, and cannot separate their emotions. So we have guilty people being supported by the public, but yet innocent people not. This is where we are in today's world, and people want to salvage this civilization. Why? Now, when I look at my story, I can relate to the elements of Willingham's story and the other examples. With my story, and perhaps these other stories, there were agendas. I've highlighted, for example, why I needed to be found guilty of allegedly assaulting a police officer and obstruction. And even the so-called criminal trial judge of that cast doubt 3 times in the ruling of that. And the reason why I needed to be found guilty was their defense for the lawsuit. And I waited up until the 11th hour to file my lawsuit. Now, I'm just going to stop here for a second. I've heard, I guess, the Crown prosecutor for Pat King, fake hero, waited until the 11th hour to file their notice to appeal his sentencing. Like, oh, look at that's terrible. Well, people don't understand how the legal system works, and sometimes you do that for a reason. I did it so I wouldn't impact the criminal trial, but they delayed it beyond the 2-year limitation period for me to sue, to see if I was going to sue. Clever. The reason why I needed to be convicted was because if I was criminally liable, found guilty, that means that all the injuries and everything that took place was my fault. And that was their defense for the lawsuit. And that's why pretty much my entire lawsuit was struck. They accomplished what they wanted to. And how did the trial judge know, in my case, that I was suing? Because the Crown prosecutor basically point blank told the judge that I was suing the city of Calgary and everyone involved and everything else. How did he do that? He asked me on the stand, is it true that I'm suing XYZ for how much? And I remember looking at the prosecutor, and I looked over at the judge, and they nodded, and that was it. That's why I needed to be found guilty. So there was an agenda there, as well as to cover up everything else, which ultimately covers up my efforts to expose first-hand knowledge of sexual abuse, sex trafficking of these vulnerable women, the nonprofit mental health organization. My being a former insider as employed by them, which Alberta Health Services funded 60% of. I ticked off a lot of people, very influential, powerful people, as well as the Alberta government. And during this time, I went through every single legal and proper means, we'll call it, to get a fair trial. I filed complaints with various governing bodies, even with the judge, because I knew where everything was going. I did make every single attempt from the start to do everything by the book. And when all that failed and I realized this is it, like my fate's already sealed, then I'm just going to use as a descriptive, I went freestyle law. So Psyops can be not necessarily for a whole population, but it can be for a very small group of people. So for example, in my story, somebody had psyoped a small group of people. Some people were willing participants, we'll say, and the same negative effect. This Willingham individual, same idea. Handful of people, powerful people, police, prosecutors, lawyers, friends and family ended up turning on him. The sad part about it all is years later it would come out that he was innocent. Who cares? He's long gone from this world. I've highlighted, for example, how there are countless of stories of men being in prison for 10, 20, 30, even 40 years for something they didn't do. The psychological impact of when everything starts is massive, and then having to deal with it over the years. And I know this firsthand. But where's everyone protesting all these cases and these kind of injustices? They rather grandstand, band together because they're weak, just like the people who impose injustices band together because they're weak. Psyops, and the studies made famous by Julia Shaw, and agendas, and here we are. This is the world. I'm anticipating this being the last video of this series, and I made all these videos in this series after I said I wouldn't be making any more videos, but, well, here I am. If you want to make change, you're not going to start at the top with the big things. You got to start at the base, at the bottom, at the foundation, and work your way up. You have to learn to run before, or sorry, you have to learn to walk before you can learn to run, type of thing. People are fighting for freedom and all this stuff. The commoner has never known freedom, true freedom. So how could they be fighting for something they've never known? Anyway, again, things to think about. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.
The email providers.
VPNs today are the biggest scam. Can I say
backdoors to the government? Yeah, everything.
most all VPNs are scams?
Well, most VPNs are owned by the Israelis.
Well, that's what I'm about to say. Well, you just gave away the punchline.
Sorry,
punchline. Blah, blah, blah. So, you think you're paying this $5.99 or $9.99 or whatever a month for this VPN? You're getting nothing, SAR. Nothing, SAR. You're getting poo on a stick, and they still have all your.
You get the ability to jump to another location so you can watch content that is geo-blocked in your location.
Fair enough.
That's the biggest plus.
That's what you get. Well, then they should just say that. They shouldn't have all this. They shouldn't have all this hoopla about privacy. They still know who you are.
Yes, and they're tracking it, and when the government says we want this information, they willingly give it up.
Oh, bro! When the government comes in with little wee guns to these VPN companies, the VPNs are like, yes, I'm no problems.
Listen to this and write it down if you can't remember it. You're never going to outgrow warfare. You simply must learn to fight. I hear people say, when is it going to get easier? When you die.